Thank you for tuning in to this special episode of Movie Geeks United. August 12th, 1988. One of the most scandalous films ever released by a major studio was unleashed upon a handful of screens, and protesters stood at the ready to undermine its chances of success. The battle had begun many years earlier. The book on which it was based was released to a firestorm of controversy in 1955. An initial attempt to produce the film was aborted in 1983 due to its potential for scandal, and once the project officially entered production a few years later, the evangelical movement rejuvenated their ambitious plans to denounce its existence. Across the world, the release of The Last Temptation of Christ was met by mass boycotts, protests, bomb threats, and actual firebombings during its run in France. Director Martin Scorsese had attempted to craft an empathetic and relatable portrait of Jesus, but his deviations from the strictest interpretations of religious text were met by an international chorus of vociferous revolt. Professor Thomas Lindlof examines all of this and so much more in his astounding book, Hollywood Under Siege: Martin Scorsese, the Religious Right, and the Culture Wars. The ambitions of both the filmmaker and his detractors, the plight of those who felt misrepresented on screen, Universal Studios' pledge to protect the First Amendment rights of its artists, and the ultimate lessons we can glean from the controversies surrounding the film. And how will the film itself be remembered? As a prime example of faith-affirming cinema, or as an ominous warning to other filmmakers who dare to offer personal interpretations of the Gospels? We spoke to Professor Lindlof in connection to the 30th anniversary of Scorsese's groundbreaking work.
In the summer of 1988, when the film came out, I was living in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm a professor at the University of Kentucky, and at that time I was living there. And I was looking forward to seeing Last Temptation because I'd always been a big fan of Scorsese. And I can't say I was particularly religious at the time, but I've always had an amateur interest in so-called historical Jesus studies, so this just looked fascinating. And then before the film got to the city, an anti-Last Temptation campaign broke out of Lexington, and at the time the Lowe's theater chain owned all the screens in town. And after a lot of pressure that was put on Lowe's, they decided not to release it in Lexington. And it didn't come to the nearest cities, Louisville or Cincinnati, so I was deprived of the opportunity to see Last Temptation, on the big screen anyway. A little bit later on, I was able to get a VHS copy at the local video rental store, and I watched it, and I saw that it was a serious film with incredible artistic value. I was really impressed with it, and so my interest was piqued about why this film inspired such a tempest, such inflamed passions, and why so many people found it threatening, in fact, and ultimately why I couldn't see it in Lexington.
I grew up in Lakeland, Florida, and the movie came out when I was just about to turn 15, and I was aware of Scorsese. I loved the movies of his that I had seen, but it didn't come to me, to my town. But even so, I do remember hearing a story before it was released that a local church congregation went to one of the theaters in town and threatened to burn their theater down if they showed it. And they had no intention of showing it anyway, but I thought it was an interesting threat.
I mean, the film, after it came out, there were lots of people that were quite upset about it, and particularly church congregations of evangelical Christians. And, after the release, there were public protests at dozens of theaters across the country, like the one that you were talking about, involving literally tens of thousands of people. There was chaos, pandemonium in many instances. In my book, I document all sorts of tactics to try to intimidate and confuse moviegoers, theater managers, employees, and even disrupt the business of the theater itself. Actually, some of these, as I mentioned in the book, were adapted from anti-abortion protests at clinics that were widespread in the 1980s. Some of the same strategies and techniques were applied to protest the Last Temptation opening, including, as you mentioned, the possibility of property damage through bombings, and so there was abusive behavior by protesters, bomb threats. Although to be fair and accurate about it, the great majority of those who protested the film did so quietly and sincerely, and really without even a hint of violence.
I'm against censorship, but that doesn't put down the fact that they're out here maligning our Lord and our Savior, and we're out here sticking up for Him. We've read the reviews. Now wait a minute.
We hear a lot today how Hollywood is out of touch with the common man, or in this case, with what audiences of religious affiliation want to see. Do you think that was that mindset really mainstream before Last Temptation, or did it kind of crescendo with Last Temptation?
Well, it was there before Last Temptation. The religious right, in many ways was offended by the film, but it was sort of a culmination of many perceived slights over the years. And there were already quite a few morality and media watchdog groups that had formed on the conservative Christian side, and there were particularly, for example, a group called American Family Association, which was really concerned about sexuality on television, and there was already a sense that Hollywood was not very welcoming to people of faith, and that in fact sometimes the studios did things, develop projects with a specific intent of trying to create controversy and not paying too much attention to whom it might harm or whose sensibilities might be offended.
First I fasted for 3 months. I even whipped myself before I went to sleep. At first it worked. Then the pain came back. And the voices. They call me by name. Jesus.
To go back to the origins of this, I mean, it's obviously based on the Kazantzakis book. Tell me about the level of controversy that met the release of that book.
Well, this was a book that was written, as you say, by Nikos Kazantzakis, actually a significant literary figure of the 20th century. He was once a finalist for the Nobel Prize, and it was a book that was exploring how Jesus could be both human and divine and what that was like. The dual nature of Christ is an article of faith in the Christian doctrine, but it's always somewhat abstract, and if it's questioned at all, it's usually discussed in intellectual terms. And Kazantzakis realized that in practical terms, a person really couldn't be fully human and fully divine, or at least if that could be possible, then exactly how would that operate? How would somebody live in the world? So, the Kazantzakis came up with this idea of a Jesus who gradually learns who he is meant to be, what his mission is supposed to be, who has doubts about whether he's the one to fulfill this destiny, often fighting it. In the novel, God talks to him through animate beings, inanimate things, whispers to him through the wind, goads him, pesters him. Meanwhile, is being tested by Satan. And so, again, what does that mean concretely? How would he be tempted? With power, with pleasures of the flesh? Certainly all those and more, but if he was fully God, couldn't he just shrug those things off? End of story. But he isn't fully God. He's a man becoming the Son of God, so Jesus must come very, very close to experiencing those things, power, pride, sexuality, and he has to gain a sense of what he's missing. So the temptations that Kazantzakis describes in the book are a taste of what it means to sin, but it's not a sin in itself.
I won't let you, no, I won't let you.
Please, I beg you, Judas, don't get in the way.
What way? What's happening to you? Who's doing this?
Struggling.
With who?
I don't know. I'm struggling.
No. I struggle. You collaborate.
The last temptation, of course, is to renounce his destiny to die on the cross. So anyway, all that is I wouldn't say it's a stark deviation from the Gospels, because he used the Gospels as a foundation for these fictional explorations, but the explorations themselves were anathema, to particularly Orthodox Catholics who felt that anything but a strict adherence to the Orthodox beliefs of the Church were problematic. And so the book was put on the list of forbidden books of the Catholic Church. The book did sell relatively well in Europe and the United States in the early 1960s. It got pretty good reviews, but in particularly Southern California, but some other places in the United States, there were some librarians who, or actually not so much librarians, but city councils and other municipal authorities that felt the book didn't belong in libraries. And so there were campaigns, as I said, particularly in Southern California, to try to get the book removed from local libraries. So it was a very controversial book, through the 1960s, even some isolated protests of libraries in the 1970s. So there was always that kind of history of the book being somewhat subversive.
I love the section of your book where you write about how the book first came to Scorsese's attention, because it happened on the set of his first, I guess you would call it legitimate film under Roger Corman's banner,
Right.
Boxcar Bertha. And it was amazing to me because I had missed Boxcar Bertha, and I just watched it a month or two ago. And so when I read this chapter of your book, and you were highlighting the kind of the religious allegory that was going on in Boxcar Bertha that mirror what occurs in Last Temptation many years later, I thought, oh my gosh, he's absolutely right, and I had to rethink that movie. But Barbara Hershey was the one that first led Scorsese on to this project, wasn't she?
That's right. They were having discussions about faith and religion and God during downtimes on the set, and as they were socializing when off camera. So she said, I'd read this book called The Last Temptation of Christ. You really should read this book. In fact, she even emphasized that he should make the film, adapt it for the screen. So after the film, Boxcar Bertha wrapped later on in Hollywood, they got together, that is David Carradine and Barbara Hershey, who were both in Boxcar Bertha, with Scorsese, and she gave him a copy of the book. And it took him several years to read the book. In talking with Marty, I confirmed the fact that he doesn't always read very quickly. In fact, sometimes it takes him a fairly long period of time to finish books. But he was very assiduous about reading that book over a period of 2 or 3 years. He finally finished reading it and decided that was the sort of material that he wanted to work with in making a film about Jesus, which he had been wanting to do literally for 15 or 20 years. Since he was going to see biblical epics as a child in New York City, he had always had an interest in that as a subject matter, and had been wanting to make a film of some kind that would feature the life of Jesus. But yes, Barbara Hershey was the one that initiated Marty to Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah, he really was the perfect director to handle this material, I believe, because there are themes that he's been grappling with in almost every movie he's made. A lot of great directors say we're only really making different versions of the same movie. I hear Scorsese saying that, and Woody Allen, and on and on and on. What he wanted to do, I think, is being raised in kind of a strict Catholic home and growing up on the biblical epics that depict Christ as an unknowable, unrelatable deity. He wanted something that made Jesus and his struggle more relatable and human. Did he know that just the nature of undertaking that approach would mire him in controversy? Was he expecting a level of controversy?
He was expecting a level of controversy, but I think he underestimated the degree of controversy that it would spark. He's mentioned this in several interviews and other publications, and I had a chance to talk to him about what his expectations were. He definitely wanted to stir discussion about the nature of Jesus and faith, and making Jesus more relatable, that people would realize that here is someone who faces the same issues, the same doubts, the same uncertainties, the same fears and frustrations that I do. And if Jesus can make it, so can I. That was a little bit of the impetus of Jesus, of Scorsese in developing Last Temptation rather than other material. I have to say, though, that this Kazantzakis novel is probably a little bit different from that. I mean, there's a little bit more emphasis in the Kazantzakis novel on Jesus simply trying to learn who he is, and not so much on how forgiving and generous with his faith Jesus is in Last Temptation. But certainly Scorsese was hoping that Last Temptation would draw people to the theater that don't go to church, would draw people to the theater to discuss faith and Christianity and Jesus in many venues after they saw the film.
He tempered somewhat some of the more extreme aspects of Schrader's screenplay, didn't he?
Yeah, there were some really interesting scenes that Schrader had written for the screenplay, the adaptation, that Marty thought really would be going too far. And so a few of those were taken out. Not that many. After Schrader turned in his screenplay, a little while later, just before Paramount got involved, Jay Cox, a longtime collaborator with Scorsese, and Marty got together and they did a revision, actually several revisions within a short period of time. And they just sort of polished some of the dialogue and took out a few of the scenes that Schrader had included that was somewhat problematic. But I think if those scenes that Schrader wrote that were a little bit beyond the pale had stayed in the film, it would have been a little bit edgier than it already was.
Yeah, absolutely. And we love Schrader. On our show, we've had him on the show a couple of times, but and he is another one like Scorsese who makes different versions of the same movie, and I love him for it. So this almost happened several years before 87, 88, under a different studio and with a different star, right?
That's right. The film was originally going to be made by Paramount, and this was during the period in which Barry Diller was head of Paramount, the entire company, which was Gulf and Western was the parent company of Paramount. And Michael Eisner was the president of the studio. Jeffrey Katzenberg was president of production. So it was sort of a golden era of sorts at Paramount. They were producing a lot of so-called high-concept films at the time, and doing quite well, as a matter of fact. And so they thought that Last Temptation of Christ would be a very interesting film to add to its slate. Certainly not, in the same category as Saturday Night Fever or some of the other films that they were producing, during the late 70s, early 1980s, but a film that could be a prestige project in which they might be able to develop a relationship with Scorsese ultimately.
Yeah.
And so they gave the green light to make Last Temptation, and this was early 1983. And for the next 10 or 11 months, just a whole number of things began to occur that led to the unraveling of the project and the ultimate cancellation of the project. In December of 1983, after approximately $2 million had already been spent, and sets had been constructed in Israel, and Scorsese and the cast were just about to go to Israel to begin shooting. But Aidan Quinn was originally going to play Jesus in the film. Most of the other cast members that were auditioned or read for parts were signed on to the film in '83, such as Harvey Keitel as Judas and Barbara Hershey for Mary Magdalene, continued in the 1988 production. But it was kind of a tumultuous year for Scorsese because it looked like he was going to be able to make his passion project. But because of the budget exploding, and there were a number of other issues concerning a lot of negative reaction that the studio was already getting, not so much in the press, but from a number of groups that had already begun to hear rumors about The Last Temptation of Christ and were spreading the word, and the studio was receiving thousands of protesting letters every week and phone calls, and the studio management, particularly Barry Diller, just didn't want to deal with that. So it was an abortive attempt to make Last Temptation. It got relatively far in the development, but it didn't go all the way. And unfortunately, that created problems for Scorsese trying to make Last Temptation after that happened, because naturally other studios wouldn't want to go through that kind of ordeal.
The project had a lot of baggage before it even got off the ground. It's interesting to me how I read it in your book is that Scorsese knew that if he ever had an opportunity to make it, that he would pretty much have to make it guerrilla-style. And so he took up a movie like After Hours to kind of rev that engine, to kind of prove to himself that, all right, this is how I'm going to do it. This is how I'm going to have to do it if it ever gets going.
Very much so. He had to make After Hours just very efficiently, and he had to work with a relatively small crew and sort of like Last Temptation, not work with a big star, but, make a film that had a really strong story, a compelling story, and had some interesting elements to it. So, that was a good training ground for Last Temptation. I would also have to say that Scorsese's earlier experience doing Boxcar Bertha for Roger Corman, and before that, Who's Knocking at My Door, films like that, which were also done very cheaply and very efficiently. Also, it was very useful when Scorsese decided that Last Temptation had to be made on a shoestring budget.
Yeah.
It looks very good on the screen. And it was shot in Morocco, but it only cost about $7 million to make. By today's standards, I guess that would be maybe a $25-30 million film. But it still went a little bit over budget, but not very much. But it was very tough to get it greenlit by Universal. In the book, I go through all the different factors that made it possible for Universal to say yes to Marty on this film. the fact that Marty was being backed by Tom Pollock at Universal, who was interested in doing some controversial projects. That Scorsese was now being represented by Michael Ovitz. At the time, Mike Ovitz was one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. He had, with several others, had formed CAA and had created this amazing talent powerhouse, and was actually getting very much involved in developing and selling projects to studios. And so, Marty told Michael Ovitz, yes, I would like for you to help me realize my dreams. I'd like you to represent me. But the one thing I really want to do is make Last Temptation of Christ. And so Ovitz, approached Tom Pollock, and Pollock, did a few things financially to make it possible for that to happen.
If you had to pick one person that really propelled it forward, it was Ovitz, right?
Pretty much. Ovitz, again, had a lot of clout, and he was interested in Scorsese because he realized that Scorsese was capable of making films that could, generate not only potential Academy Award nominations and winners for studios, but also successful films. Scorsese had just made The Color of Money, right after Hours, The Color of Money with Paul Newman and Tom Cruise, who were both CAA talent, and so it was apparent to Ovitz that this is somebody who would be able to be very valuable in not only generating revenues for studios, but also in being able to utilize other people within the CAA orbit, other actors, other writers, other people that might work with Scorsese. So, Ovitz was very instrumental in making that project happen.
They were so desperate to be at the Martin Scorsese business that, there's always that phrase, one for them, one for me, but they were willing to accept that the first project would be one for him, and then hopefully future projects would be for them. So that was a bold decision, I think.
That's right. And Pollock pointed that out to me, that typically, like in the case of Steven Spielberg, Spielberg had made a number of hits with Universal, and when he was interested in making Schindler's List, he had already delivered for them. And Scorsese arrives at Universal, and he hadn't made any successful films for Universal. He'd never done a Universal film before. So this is putting the cart before the horse, actually. He was given the opportunity to make a film that no other studio would touch, and a film that, almost every other studio, being as risk-averse as it is, would have to realize that there could be some danger in going into this territory. But again, I think that Tom Pollock was a little bit of an unusual studio head at the time. He was given enormous latitude as well to pick projects by Lew Wasserman and Sid Sheinberg, who ran MCA. And they just said, basically, Pollock would be able to pick the projects, and he'd be judged on the outcome. And Wasserman was actually... he wasn't involved in the management of the crisis later on the summer of 1988, but he certainly helped shore up support for Scorsese, and never backed away from the release of the film, even when there was just enormous pressure for Universal to do that, because there was some fear that the parent company, MCA, could be in some financial peril if it continued to back a film that was hated by hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people. And there were some credible threats of boycotts against MCA and its varied assets, and but Wasserman was someone who did trust that Pollock would make the right decision. Yeah,
he stuck by his creative team, and that's really heartening, at least in this case. You know, with looking at Scorsese today, it's such a great period of time for him because he's never had higher budgets or higher grosses than he has the past decade or so. It's kind of an amazing last phase run that he's on. But as you said, this movie was done for a biblical epic on the relative cheap side in Morocco with a largely non-English speaking crew. It's interesting to me how he would be living with this book for 15, 16 years. When it finally gets time to shoot it, you got to do it as quickly as possible. Did you get a sense of, did he feel defeated? Did he feel that he wasn't accomplishing the vision he'd had in his head all those years as he was doing it?
I think that he felt that he was being able to achieve what he wanted to, because everything had been plotted out, all the setups, all the scenes in meticulous detail before they got to Morocco. And even though I think the production, the shooting actually was only about 6 or 7 days over schedule, he was able to get everything that he wanted as planned for this production. And I mean, there were a few scenes and a few shots that he wasn't able to get, but the sense that I got is that the urgency of making this film actually contributed to what he wanted to achieve on the screen. You know, the urgency of some of the scenes themselves was almost reflected, if not propelled, by the way in which the filmmaking, the guerrilla-style filmmaking, was proceeding in Morocco.
You think it's a blessing to know what God wants? I'll tell you what he wants. He wants to push me over. Can't he see what's inside of me? All my sins.
We all sin.
Not my sins. I'm a liar, a hypocrite. I'm afraid of everything. I don't ever tell the truth. I don't have the courage. When I see a woman, I blush and look away. I want her, but I don't take her for God, and that makes me proud. And then my pride ruins Magdalene. I don't steal, I don't fight, I don't kill, not because I don't want to, but because I'm afraid. I want to rebel against you, against everything, against God, but I'm afraid. You want to know who my mother and father are? You want to know who my God is? Fear. You look inside me and that's all you'll find.
When I read your book and I read about the initial plans to make it in '83, you can't help but think, how different would it have been with an Aidan Quinn as opposed to Willem Dafoe? I think that Willem Dafoe adds he's an exotic actor. And it gives the character a certain edge, I think, and a fascination, just by nature of having a face like that on screen, right. I think. Did Willem Dafoe have any trepidation in getting involved in this project, or was he as gung-ho as Scorsese from the outset?
From the outset, he was gung-ho. He wanted to do this. He wanted to work with Scorsese. The prospect of playing Jesus didn't seem to be even particularly intimidating to him. He recognized that he had a responsibility for that role, not just to the material, but to the notion that the character represents a very important religious figure who is worshipped by hundreds of millions of people around the world. But he felt like he didn't really have to match any previous portrayals, or he didn't want to be influenced by any of the imagery, iconography, any of the narrative portrayals from earlier films or other media. And he just wanted to understand the character and what the character was trying to do in the film. And so he spent a lot of time just doing a little bit of his own Bible study, as he mentioned it to me, and he also read some works on the concept of forgiveness that Scorsese had given him. I think forgiveness became a little bit more of an emphasized theme in the film, certainly compared to the Kazantzakis novel. But I think that Dafoe was, embracing this role.
It is accomplished.
Another anecdote that I thought was incredible in your book, the last shot of the film, where the film kind of flashes to white.
It is accomplished.
That wasn't a post-production choice. That was actually that shot. It flashed the negative. The light seeped into the reel, the camera, didn't it?
Yeah. They were shooting the very last shot of the film, and as the film magazine was being taken down from the camera, there was some light leakage, and so what you see in the very last seconds of the film, the sort of color that's fluttering and it goes to white is actually a total accident. It was not designed to be that way. Scorsese felt like I think there was more than one take, but he felt like this was a fitting into the film. In some way, for him, it suggested the resurrection to follow.
But again, you have to understand the reason why there's this reaction against the story or the picture is because these are, of course, very personal views. This is, I find, interpreting Jesus through Kazantzakis onto film by way of Paul Schrader and myself and Jay Cox, who also did some of the writing, and finally Willem Dafoe. We're interpreting Jesus on a very one-to-one level in a very personal way. It's as I said before, it's my own way. It's like making a very personal film, and it seems that anyone who really believes fully and solely in the errancy of the Bible, that one cannot deter one word from the Bible, from what is written, would have understandably would have a problem with this interpretation and with this approach.
At a certain point in time, Universal did assign some bodyguards to protect Scorsese, and they also guard him at his apartment. Scorsese obviously began to do some interviews by July in anticipation of the film's release, including memorable appearance on ABC's Nightline program in which he was speaking. He was on the show with Donald Wildman, who was one of the main leaders of the opposition to The Last Temptation release.
When they were preparing for the release, months and months in advance, the studio brought on kind of a liaison to work between the studio and the religious community, kind of to gauge the community's concerns and assuage any trepidations they might have about the film. Was that obviously a calculated move, but to what extent did that work? Yeah,
the studio, I suppose, took its cue from the problems that was faced by Paramount 5 years earlier, in being totally unprepared for a harsh negative reaction from the conservative Christian community. And the studio felt if they were to engage the services of a public relations consultant who specializes in religious-themed films, particularly Christian market films, and sort of bring this consultant into the fold, share with the consultant some aspects of the movie being in final post-production development, and also serve as a bridge to the evangelical community, so that he would this is Tim Penland was the name of this Christian consultant. Penland would then be able to show the some of the leaders of the Christian community, not only those that might be predisposed to not like the film, but others as well, show the film to them eventually before it gets released, so that they have an idea of exactly what the film contains, and be able to hear from the director himself about his motives for making the film. So it was an effort by the studio to try to tamp down any potential negative reaction based on rumor or baseless rumor in advance, and sort of pave the way for a little bit smoother reception by the religious communities of the country. So that was the intent. At the same time, the studio hired another public relations consultant, whose job it was to try to understand the Christians and blunt any possible actions that might threaten the film itself. So Universal had two different consultants that were working on the film. They didn't really have any communication with each other, and in some ways they were sort of working at cross purposes. So that was an interesting part of the publicity effort for the film.
And interesting too, I think the public relations expert you're talking about, he's the one that when he first took the assignment, and I think he read the material, his reaction was, "What, are you crazy? Why is Universal making making this? They have no idea what they're getting themselves into."
Right. Yeah, Josh Barron was the other consultant, and he had a lot of experience with working in crisis communications, and he's a former Buddhist monk. He did know something about comparative religion, and he understood that this was incendiary material to Christian believers, and that it would cross many, many lines for them. And so, he frankly thought that the studio had made a mistake in making the film in the first place. But he was predicting that there could be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of protesters at the studio's doorstep, that they'd have to defend motion picture theaters, that all sorts of very difficult, untoward things could happen that might threaten MCA, the parent company itself. Now, I got this from an interview with Josh Barron, and he was telling me this in retrospect, and I think I believe him, but I don't know, to what degree, all these calamitous events were being predicted by Josh Barron in January, February of 1988, months before the film was released. But he clearly had a sense, though, that the film was much more controversial than the studio thought. And it was his job to start preparing the studio for that.
And the studio actually, they released the film early with little advance notice to kind of get a jump start on any potential protests.
Yeah, the original release date was in September. It was going to be shown at the New York Film Festival and then have kind of a platform rollout release. But during the summer of 1988, things really escalated in terms of Christian radio stations broadcasting, information about the film, about the danger that it posed to Christian beliefs and values. Quite a few of the televangelists on their TV and radio programs were also inveighing against the film. A man named Bill Bright, who was head of the Christian Crusade for Christ, the Campus Crusade for Christ, was offering to buy the film from Universal and burn all the print copies. There was just a number of really outrageous. And then there was R.L. Heimers, who was a local minister in Los Angeles, who launched some anti-Semitic attacks on Sid Sheinberg and Lou Wasserman in connection with the film. So there was just a lot of danger that the studio was wading into, and they thought that it was the better part of valor to go ahead and release the film as early as they possibly could, just as soon as Scorsese was able to lock in the film, and they were able to produce prints in order to get the film distributed. So they moved the release date up to August 12th, I believe, and there was never really intended to be much advertising for the film. There were never any television ads that ran for Last Temptation. There were some trailers that were shown in theaters, but not that many. But it was released very quickly, and Josh Barron, who was again helping develop the crisis communications for the film, realized that with this great hurry in getting the film out, they had to make sure that theaters were protected. And so he hired a team of field crisis people to go out and sort of mediate between the police and the protesters and the theater owners, and just try to make sure that the film was released with as little potential for injury or property damage as possible.
The religious right, they saw this, going back to 88, when you have the burgeoning of televangelism and that whole movement, but they saw this as an opportunity somehow, an outreach opportunity based on outrage of this film.
Yeah, they saw it as a way to reclaim some of their lost legitimacy. The release of Last Temptation came really just on the heels of some embarrassing scandals in the evangelical world. This seems like such ancient history now, but Jim Baker, who was head of the PTL organization, Praise the Lord organization, had a sexual scandal. Same thing with Jimmy Swaggart. Oral Roberts was also mired in controversy with some of his statements. And also at the end of the Reagan era, there was a feeling among certain leaders in the conservative Christian community that Reagan really had not delivered on some of the promises that he had made to them, both privately and publicly, when he first ran for president in 1980. So they were feeling a little bit dispirited, and in the wake of some of these scandals, fundraising suffered. Poor public image often results in issues concerning the support of their causes, and so they looked upon Last Temptation. I don't know if you would, say this is a cynical attitude or not, but they saw Last Temptation as a way to help rebuild their membership lists, to get people energized, to get them enthusiastic, and to ultimately contribute more to the coffers of some of these organizations. And that is what happened. American Family Association increases membership list significantly as a result of making Last Temptation of Christ the target, and encouraging people to become members and receive newsletters so they can hear the latest news about Last Temptation and where to write to make their views known and so forth. So it was a big moneymaker for some of those organizations.
Yeah. You hear about people say that all press is good press, and ultimately controversy is only beneficial to your product because it's extra exposure and it makes more people curious about it. Using Last Temptation as a case study, is that valid? I mean, what was the controversy ultimately helpful to the film?
Well, that's an interesting question. The empirical data bear out that it actually drew record audiences in the first 2 or 3 weeks when it opened in some of the major markets in the United States, particularly some cities that were a little bit more, I guess you could say, had a more liberal cultural climate, like Seattle, San Francisco, Minneapolis, New York, etc. But after the first few weeks, the box office performance declined, and Last Temptation just barely made back its production costs from domestic receipts. And it's been speculated that there are a lot of people who basically decide not to see Last Temptation because of the controversy. They didn't want to be hassled by protesters, or they had heard certain things about the film that made them think that it was disrespectful to Christianity, and that it would be offensive to their own sensibilities. So, I don't know. It's kind of a mixed picture. The film has had a very long life in VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, other formats, and actually did quite well internationally. It made about $20 to $25 million overseas, even though it was censored in about 12 countries. But in this case, it's hard to say because it's such an unusual circumstance. The film was released in only about 140 theaters in the United States. I mean,
and it grossed a little over $8 million, which is a great gross for such a limited release, I think.
That's right. I mean, just think about that for a moment. 140 theaters. I mean, and this was over a span of 4 or 5 months. It was released in August, and its time in first run in theaters had ended by December '88 or January '89. And I mean, even in the 1980s, a wide release was probably about 1,000 theaters. So that they chose very carefully where Last Temptation would be released. And there are some theater chains that just decided we're not going to book Last Temptation at all in any of our markets. The one that was most significant was a chain at the time called General Cinema, which was one of the top exhibitors in the country. And the head of General Cinema was being almost begged by Universal to at least look at the film, to do an exhibitor screening of the film, but they refused to even look at the film. And so that was a big blow to the exhibition prospects of the film. But
theaters undergoing bomb threats and protests, and it's not a very appealing prospect for a lot of theater owners, I would think. But you said that the studio's profit on the film was really hampered by just the cost of placing security in all of these theaters. Even if it was just 140 theaters, it was still a hefty price tag.
Well, that's true. Universal still had to pay about $1 million just for the security and the special handling of the film, and that was a lot of money because they had to hire off-duty police. They had to finance ways to protect the theater in terms of barricades, and there was the advance team, the field crisis team that was sent out to various theaters for weeks on end. So, there was a lot of money that was spent on security. And I think that theater chains like General Cinema just decided that we don't want to alienate our customer base for this one film. And security was also a consideration. They didn't want to have their theaters bombed. And they didn't want to jeopardize people going in to see other movies, at the multiplex while Last Temptation was showing. I mean, there were a lot of considerations there.
Well, despite this heated controversy, or more likely because of the heated controversy, The Last Temptation of Christ opened to capacity crowds this weekend, grossing close to $500,000. Is the film blasphemy or an affirmation of faith? Today you're going to hear from the leaders of the movement against the film and those who openly support a Christian's right to see this film and everybody else's right to see it. First, meet one of the film's leading critics.
The high-profile evangelical leaders that actually saw the film, by and large, would you say they understood its point of view and they didn't see it as a film worthy of scandal, or not?
by and large, they didn't like the film. Some of them hated it. I spoke to some of the people that actively protested the film, that organized protests, that were talk show hosts on Christian radio stations, that urged people not to go see the film. They did go see screenings of the film, and I don't think they understood the perspective of the movie as intended by Scorsese and Kazantzakis before him, and Schrader. I don't think they understood what the film was trying to do. The film, one of your question was this seen as a faith affirming film? It does all the things that are described in the Gospels. Jesus' ministry. He performs miracles in the film. He dies on the cross. I mean, the basic template of Jesus' life is depicted in the film, but what's radically different about the film is that Jesus is relatable. He has doubts. He has uncertainties. He is tempted, in a variety of ways, in very palpable ways. And he does initially renounce his mission on the cross, but just for an instant. He is tempted for an instant, and it's that last 40 minutes of the film that is that was very disturbing to these Christian leaders. Even though it was portrayed as a hallucination, if you will, but the notion that Jesus would marry Mary Magdalene and later on her sisters, he would help propagate children. He would die an old man without ever having fulfilled his destiny as a savior to mankind. That was totally anathema. And to these people that saw the film, that up to that point had been basing their opinions on what they had heard about the script. But once they saw the film, at least the ones I talked to, and from my research, they didn't really change their mind about the film, and they still don't. I mean, it's obviously not a hot button film anymore, but I don't think with time there's been any softening of opposition to the film among those who initially opposed it.
When it all boils down, it's really the sex scene with Mary Magdalene that was the clincher for most people that refused to see it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there were some other issues, such as Harvey Keitel's Judas entering into a co-conspirator arrangement, arranging the events leading up to the betrayal and the crucifixion. That, I mean, in the Gospels, Judas is one of Jesus' disciples, but he's portrayed there as being, the great betrayer. But, of course, in the film, he and Judas are lifelong friends, and Jesus actually has to persuade Judas to carry this out. So that was also something that some of the more conservative critics felt was out of bounds. But I think you're right. I think it was the sexuality in the film.
Yeah, it always comes back to sex.
In one way or another.
Just whenever you see a controversy somewhere, it's always somehow about sex. The incident in France, we had a lot of threats here in the States, but some of those threats were actually carried out, destruction in France.
Yeah, there were many theaters in France that were firebombed. And then there was one in Paris. This happened across the country, from the south of France up to Paris and other surrounding cities. But there was a theater, I think it was the Saint Michel in Paris, that was firebombed, and several people were injured. So yeah, it was quite serious there.
Wow.
I think France got a stronger reaction. Had a stronger reaction because there was probably a little bit more of a connection to the kind of protests that are happening in the United States and some of the same issues. There was a really strong conservative party in France. Jean-Marie Le Pen was the leader of this political party, and quite a few of its followers or partisans had very strong anti-abortion views. And so this all kind of tied into sort of a cultural war atmosphere in France, separate from but very much related to what was happening in the United States. You didn't see that kind of reaction in other Catholic countries, heavily Catholic countries in Europe. There was hardly any word of protest in Italy or in Spain. There was some violent reaction in Greece, but certainly, France was the epicenter, no question about that.
Yeah. Where do you think 30 years after the release of that movie, and we've had so many more great Scorsese movies since, where do you think Last Temptation fits in his legacy? I mean, what categorization will it hold?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a subset of his films that are overtly spiritual films. I mean, we were talking earlier about Boxcar Bertha, how symbolic imagery and some subtextual references of religion are woven into the film. But the film is really not about that. But Kundun, the most recent film Silence, and Last Temptation constitute this interesting subset of films that, and they're always very personal projects. They're always films that he has to fight to get approved or has to deliver a commercial hit to a studio in order to have the permission to make films like that. And I don't know. My own opinion is that Last Temptation is still a standout in that group of Scorsese films that have overtly spiritual themes. I think it's probably the film that expresses most directly his own concerns about faith and about how to make moral choices, in a corrupt world. I think Last Temptation probably has grown in critical estimation over the years. I'm not sure I have a real firm basis for saying that, but I think it's looked upon as a very as almost a quintessential spiritual film for Scorsese.